I'm going to say something that most people are not ready to hear. Cheating is not the same mistake for men and women. It never has been. And pretending otherwise is one of the most dangerous lies modern relationships are built on. I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to blame. I'm here to explain what actually happens beneath the surface, inside the brain, the body, and the instincts we don't like to admit we still have. Because once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. And what you don't see is what destroys you. When a man cheats, people get angry. When a woman cheats, people look for reasons. That a double standard didn't appear by accident. It exists because on a deep biological level, everyone knows something they're afraid to say out loud. Female infidelity doesn't damage a relationship the same way. It ends it. Most men find this out too late. After the shock, after the gaslighting, after they're trying to fix something that's already dead. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the uncomfortable truth calmly, clearly, without slogans or ideology. Just reality. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you value honest conversations about relationships and human nature, consider subscribing. Quietly, intentionally. I want to begin where most conversations about infidelity immediately collapse. The idea of fairness. People say cheating is cheating, that betrayal is betrayal, that pain is pain. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, morally clean, emotionally comforting, but it ignores how human beings actually function. I learned this the hard way, not through ideology, but through observation. Patterns repeat whether we approve of them or not. And the first pattern is the social reaction. When a man cheats, the verdict is immediate. He is selfish, immature, disloyal. There is no curiosity about context, no search for deeper causes. The story ends with his guilt. When a woman cheats, the reaction changes tone. People lean in. They ask questions. What was missing? Was she neglected? Was she unhappy? Did he fail her in some invisible way? This difference is not random. It exists because instinctively people understand that the outcomes are not symmetrical. Society reacts differently because the damage is different. I'm not saying one is good and the other is bad. I'm saying they are not the same event wearing different clothes. They are different processes with different consequences. And pretending otherwise blinds people to what's actually happening inside a relationship. Here is the core truth that most people resist: male infidelity and female infidelity operate on different psychological and biological tracks. They intersect at the word cheating, but they diverge immediately after. When a man cheats, the act usually exists in isolation. It is contained, compartmentalized. The sex happens and it ends. His emotional investment, his long-term plans, his sense of identity as a partner often remain anchored to his primary relationship. That doesn't excuse the behavior. It explains the aftermath. He often wants to fix what he damaged. When a woman cheats, the act is rarely isolated. It is the visible surface of a process that has already been unfolding internally. By the time it becomes physical, the relationship has already shifted at a structural level. This is where people accuse me of bias. They hear explanation and mistake it for judgment. But I'm not assigning virtue. I'm describing mechanics. Biology does not negotiate with ideology. It does not adjust itself to cultural narratives about equality. It operates silently, consistently, and without apology. You can ignore it, but you cannot turn it off. The reason society searches for explanations when a woman cheats is not compassion. It is intuition. On a subconscious level, people sense that something fundamental has already changed. They assume there must be a cause because the effect is irreversible. That intuition is correct. Female infidelity is rarely impulsive. It does not appear out of nowhere. It is the final step in a psychological transition. By the time it happens, attachment has already been redirected. The emotional center of gravity has shifted away from the relationship. This is why people say things like, "She must have been unhappy for a long time." Not because it's always true in the factual sense, but because it's true in the biological sense. Her system does not switch targets instantly. It reorients. Men often misunderstand this because they project their own internal experience onto women. They assume symmetry. If sex doesn't change how they feel, they assume it doesn't change how she feels either. That assumption is where most men lose the plot. I used to believe that cheating was a single decision, a moment of weakness, a moral failure. What I eventually realized is that for women, cheating is usually a conclusion, not a beginning. This explains another uncomfortable pattern. When men are caught cheating, they often show genuine remorse. Not performance, not panic, real guilt. They try to repair the damage because emotionally they never left. Their attachment system is still pointed at their partner. When women are caught cheating, the emotional tone is different. There may be tears, there may be apologies, but there is also distance, a kind of emotional vacancy. The relationship feels hollow because it already is. People mistake this for cruelty or indifference. It isn't. It's detachment. The bond has already been severed internally. What you're seeing is the aftermath, not the act itself. This is why reconciliation fails so often after female infidelity, not because she refuses to try, but because the emotional circuitry that sustained the relationship has already been dismantled. You cannot repair a structure whose foundation has been removed. The double standard exists because people recognize, even if they can't articulate it, that female infidelity represents an endpoint. Male infidelity represents a rupture. One can sometimes be healed, the other usually cannot. This also explains why women react so strongly to male cheating. The question they ask is never about sex. It is always about emotion. Do you love her? That question reveals everything. What they fear is not the physical act. It is the redirection of emotional investment. Women understand intuitively what emotional attachment means. They know its power. They know that once it moves, it does not return easily. So when they see a man cheat, they are not reacting to the act itself. They are reacting to the possibility that his attachment might move the way theirs does. Men, on the other hand, often assume that if both partners cheat, the scales are balanced. They are not. One side scratched the surface. The other detonated the foundation. This is not an opinion. It is an observable pattern. The problem is that modern culture refuses to acknowledge asymmetry. We insist that identical labels imply identical processes. They do not. Two things can share a name and still be fundamentally different in effect. Calling both behaviors cheating creates the illusion of equality while masking the reality of outcome. And that illusion is what leaves men confused, blindsided, and trying to save something that no longer exists. Understanding this difference is not about bitterness. It is about clarity. You cannot protect yourself from what you refuse to see. You cannot navigate a system if you deny its rules. Once you accept that male and female infidelity function differently, the rest of the patterns start to make sense. The sudden emotional withdrawal, the rewriting of history, the lack of interest in repair. None of it is random. It is a process reaching its conclusion, And most men don't realize the conclusion was reached long before the truth came out. To understand why these outcomes diverge so sharply, I need to slow this down and talk about how men experience sex versus how women experience sex. Not in theory, not in slogans, in practice. When I was younger, I believed men and women processed intimacy the same way. I believed desire, attachment, and loyalty were interchangeable variables. Experience corrected that belief. Observation confirmed it. Men have a unique psychological ability: compartmentalization. We can isolate actions from emotions. We can separate behavior from identity. This is not virtue, it is wiring. A man can have sex and feel nothing afterward. No longing, no attachment, no internal shift. The act ends, and mentally he returns to his primary relationship unchanged. His plans remain intact. His emotional loyalty remains anchored. His sense of us survives the mistake. That doesn't make the act harmless. It makes it contained. This is why male infidelity is often impulsive. Opportunity presents itself. Desire spikes. Judgment fails. The decision is made in a narrow window without long-term calculation. When the moment passes, reality returns. Guilt follows. Fear follows. The man understands he risked something valuable for something meaningless. I've watched men cheat and then spend years trying to undo the damage. They cut contact. They overcorrect. They recommit. Not because they were forced, but because emotionally they never left. This is why male cheating can sometimes be repaired. The attachment system was never reassigned. It was violated, not abandoned. Women do not operate this way. This is where people get uncomfortable because the explanation sounds like an excuse when it isn't. Women do not have the same capacity to detach sex from bonding. The female brain is not designed for emotional neutrality during intimacy. When a woman has sex, her brain releases oxytocin, not in theory, not metaphorically, chemically. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone. It exists to create attachment, trust, emotional connection. This is not a moral choice. It is an automatic biological response. Her brain does not ask permission. It initiates bonding whether she wants it or not. I've heard women say it was just sex. I've heard them swear there were no feelings involved. I don't doubt their honesty. I doubt their awareness. Because the bonding process does not require conscious intention. It operates beneath rational thought. It is ancient, reliable, indifferent to modern narratives about independence and equality. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. For most of human history, sex carried a significant risk for women. Pregnancy, vulnerability, dependency. A woman who bonded with the man she slept with increased her odds of survival. Her offspring's odds too. So women evolved to attach. Modern birth control did not rewrite that code. Social progress did not delete it. The software is still running, even if the environment has changed. This is why female infidelity is rarely just physical. Even when it begins that way, it doesn't stay there. The bonding mechanism activates. Emotional investment follows. The brain starts evaluating the new partner, not as an experience, but as a potential replacement. Men struggle to accept this because they project their own internal experience onto women. They assume symmetry. They assume if it meant nothing to them, it must mean nothing to her. That assumption is fatal. I've watched men try to negotiate reality after discovering infidelity. They ask the wrong questions. They focus on frequency, on duration, on sexual details. They believe the scale of betrayal determines the outcome. It doesn't. What matters is attachment, and attachment shifts differently for women. Once oxytocin-driven bonding begins, the brain does something remarkable. It starts re-evaluating existing attachments. The old bond weakens. Irritation appears, resentment surfaces, familiarity turns into contempt. This is not conscious sabotage. It is neurological reorganization. The brain cannot sustain two primary attachments simultaneously. When a new bond strengthens, the old one must dissolve. That dissolution feels sudden to the partner experiencing it, but internally it has been building for months. This explains the behavioral shift men often describe. One day everything is fine. The next day nothing they do is right. The tone changes. The warmth disappears. Intimacy feels forced. Respect erodes. Men assume something external caused this. Stress, work, hormones, depression. They don't realize the system has already chosen a new target. Female infidelity doesn't begin in bed. It begins in attention, in emotional engagement, in conversations that feel harmless until they aren't. By the time sex occurs, the relationship has already been displaced. This is also why women who cheat often appear emotionally calm afterward. The chaos already happened internally. What you see is resolution, not confusion. Men, by contrast, are emotionally destabilized by their own cheating because the act violated their values without altering their attachments. The internal conflict remains unresolved. Guilt lingers. This is why men often confess. Women rarely do. Confession requires remorse. Remorse requires emotional loyalty to the relationship. When that loyalty has already shifted, confession offers no relief. It only accelerates consequences. So women conceal, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Their internal transition is complete. They are managing logistics now, not emotions. This is where many men make their biggest mistake. They assume time and effort can reverse the shift. They believe counseling, apologies, and self-improvement can restore what was lost. But you cannot rebuild attachment once it has been reassigned. I've watched men perform emotional CPR on relationships that died months earlier. They mistake motion for life. They confuse cooperation with connection. They believe staying together means healing is possible. What they don't understand is that the woman's emotional system is no longer oriented toward them. She may stay physically. She may stay legally. She may stay out of fear or convenience. But the bond is gone. Male infidelity injures a relationship. Female infidelity replaces it. This is why the outcomes are so different. This is why the recovery trajectories diverge. This is why pretending the behaviors are identical leads to catastrophic miscalculation. None of this makes women evil. Makes them human, bound by the same evolutionary constraints as men, just expressed differently. The tragedy is not biology. The tragedy is ignorance. Men are taught to interpret betrayal through their own lens. They are never taught how the other system actually works. So they respond with the wrong tools at the wrong time to the wrong problem. And by the time they realize what's really happening, the decision has already been made. Once the bonding process begins, everything else follows with brutal consistency. This is where men usually lose their footing because the change doesn't look dramatic at first. It looks subtle, psychological, easy to dismiss. I want to talk about what actually happens inside a woman once that bonding switch flips. Not metaphorically, mechanically. Oxytocin does not just create attachment. It reorganizes priority. It tells the brain this person matters. And when the brain assigns that status to someone new, it must remove it from someone else. There is no neutral state. This is where the idea of mate switching comes in. It sounds clinical because it is. Mate switching is not betrayal in the emotional sense. It is reassignment. The emotional system disengages from one partner and locks onto another. When that process starts, the original relationship begins to decay rapidly. Not because the woman suddenly becomes cruel or dishonest, but because her perception shifts. What once felt safe now feels dull. What once felt familiar now feels irritating. What once felt loving now feels suffocating. Men often describe this phase in the same way. They say, "She changed overnight." She didn't. The change just crossed a visible threshold. This is why arguments appear out of nowhere. Small behaviors become unbearable. Things you've done the same way for years suddenly provoke contempt. Your jokes aren't funny anymore. Your presence feels intrusive. Your attempts at affection feel awkward or unwelcome. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the inside, it feels justified. The brain is actively detaching. This detachment is not passive. It is reinforced. Every interaction with the new attachment strengthens the bond. Every interaction with the old partner weakens it. The system is self-correcting. It pushes toward resolution. At this stage, the woman may not consciously recognize what's happening. She may tell herself she's stressed, confused, burned out. She may believe the relationship is the problem, not the process. And this is where history starts to change. The brain cannot tolerate internal contradiction. It cannot accept I'm betraying someone who didn't deserve it. So it rewrites the narrative. The relationship becomes reinterpreted as flawed, empty, or emotionally lacking. Past happiness is downgraded. Conflicts are amplified. Neutral memories are reclassified as negative. This is not lying. This is cognitive restructuring. Men try to argue facts during this phase. They bring up shared memories, trips, sacrifices, good years. It doesn't work because they are arguing against a rewritten internal record. The woman is not denying reality as she experiences it. Her reality has changed. This is one of the most painful parts for men. They feel erased, as if the relationship never mattered, as if years of commitment vanished without explanation. But from her perspective, the explanation feels complete. The story makes sense to her. The emotional logic is airtight. This is why female infidelity feels so final. It is not just an act. It is a psychological migration. Once the emotional system has relocated, the body often follows. Hormonal patterns shift. Desire recalibrates. Attraction narrows toward the new partner and fades toward the old one. There are studies showing that women are attracted to different traits depending on hormonal states. Birth control alone alters attraction patterns. Now imagine what happens when a woman's entire bonding system reorganizes around a specific individual. Her body prepares for alignment with the new attachment. Her interest in the old partner declines not as a choice, but as a consequence. Men misinterpret this as rejection. They assume they need to try harder, improve themselves, win her back. They believe attraction can be negotiated. At this stage, it cannot. This is why sex often disappears before cheating is discovered. The body has already disengaged. The bond has already shifted. Intimacy with the original partner feels wrong even if she can't explain why. What's important to understand is that this process often begins before anything physical happens with the new man. Emotional intimacy alone can trigger it. Long conversations, shared vulnerability, validation, being seen in a way that feels novel. By the time sex occurs, it is not a beginning. It is confirmation. Men assume sex creates the betrayal. In many cases, sex only reveals it. This is why female infidelity blindsides men. There is no sudden escalation they can point to. No obvious red flag they recognize as danger. The transition happens internally quietly, while life continues on the surface. She still shows up, still goes to work, still talks about the future, but the emotional investment has already been redirected. And here's the part that men rarely understand. Until it's too late, once mate switching completes, reversal is almost impossible. The brain does not like ambiguity. It seeks closure. Once it commits to a new attachment, it reinforces that decision aggressively. Doubt is treated as a threat to stability. This is why women who cheat rarely want to repair the relationship, even if they say they do. They may agree to counseling. They may say the right things. But emotionally, they are already oriented elsewhere. Reconciliation in this context is maintenance, not restoration. Men feel this instinctively. They describe it as something being off. The words are right, but the energy is gone. The effort feels mechanical. The affection feels staged. They try to ignore that feeling. They tell themselves healing takes time, that trust can be rebuilt, that patience will fix it. But patience does not reverse reassignment. This is also why women often seem cold during the aftermath. Not cruel, just distant. Their emotional processing is complete. They are not in crisis. They are in transition management. Men, by contrast, are still processing shock. Their attachment system is intact. They are trying to restore equilibrium that only exists for them. This mismatch creates profound suffering. One partner is grieving, the other is planning. Understanding this does not make it hurt less, but it explains why trying harder often makes things worse. Effort cannot compete with redirected attachment. This is not about effort. It is about orientation. Once a woman's emotional system has chosen a new direction, everything else follows. The relationship is no longer a shared structure. It is a shell being vacated. And most men don't realize the move happened long before they noticed the door was open. There was a moment when all of this stopped being theoretical for me. Until then, I understood the patterns intellectually. I had seen fragments of them. But I hadn't watched the entire process unfold in real time. That changed through someone close to me. My former business partner, I'll call him Daniel, was not a careless man. He was disciplined, focused. He built his company from nothing brick by brick over 2 decades. He married his college sweetheart, Emily. 2 children, a large home in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of life people point to when they talk about stability. There were no visible cracks, no abuse, no chaos. If anything, Daniel was predictable to a fault. He provided. He showed up. He assumed that consistency equaled security. That assumption was his blind spot. Emily joined a local book club. Nothing unusual. Suburban professionals, wine, discussion, intellectual escape from routine. Daniel encouraged it. He thought stimulation was healthy. He trusted her. One man in that group stood out. Recently divorced, English professor, soft-spoken, introspective, financially unstable, lived alone in a small apartment. By every conventional metric, he was not competition. Daniel never saw him as a threat. And that was the point. The bond didn't begin physically. It began in conversation, long discussions about themes, characters, meaning, vulnerability disguised as intellect, shared emotional language. Emily felt seen in a way that felt new. From the outside, nothing changed. She still came home, still talked about her day, still functioned as a wife and mother. But internally, the orientation had shifted. The book club became more important. The conversations extended beyond meetings. Texts appeared. Inside jokes formed. Emotional intimacy grew under the cover of plausibility. This is how mate switching begins. Quietly, respectably, without breaking any obvious rules. Daniel noticed changes, but he misinterpreted them. Emily became critical. Small things irritated her. She questioned decisions she had supported for years. She described feeling unfulfilled but couldn't define how. Daniel responded the way most men do. He tried to fix it. More date nights, more attention, more effort. He didn't realize he was competing with novelty itself. By the time anything physical happened, if it even mattered at that point, Emily was already gone. The bonding process had completed. Her brain had reassigned attachment. When she finally told Daniel she was leaving, he was stunned. The explanation didn't make sense to him. The professor earned a fraction of his income, offered no stability, no future security, no tangible upgrade, but that wasn't the criteria. From Emily's perspective, the relationship had been emotionally dead for a long time. She described Daniel as intellectually absent, emotionally shallow, a good provider, but not a partner. None of this had ever been expressed before. Daniel replayed the last 20 years looking for evidence. He found none, because the narrative was new, reconstructed to justify the outcome. That is the part men never see coming. She didn't leave because the professor was better. She left because he was new, because he activated the bonding system at a time when routine had dulled perception. The brain does not evaluate partners objectively once attachment shifts. It romanticizes the new and devalues the old. This is not deliberate cruelty. It is neurological prioritization. Emily spoke about the professor as if he were profound, as if their connection were rare, as if Daniel had never truly known her. Daniel was destroyed. He kept asking the same question, what does he have that I don't? The answer was simple and devastating. He had access to her bonding system at the right moment. That was enough. What shocked me most was how complete the transformation was. Emily did not hesitate. She did not waver. She did not look back. From the moment she made the decision, everything aligned behind it. Logistics followed, explanations solidified, social support gathered. Daniel, meanwhile, was still in shock, still trying to understand what he missed, still operating under the assumption that relationships dissolve gradually. They don't always. Sometimes they end long before anyone announces it. This is the part people misunderstand when they hear stories like this. They assume the woman chose chaos over stability, emotion over reason, that she made a bad decision, that framing is wrong. From her internal perspective, the decision felt inevitable. The emotional system had already moved. Staying would have felt like betrayal to herself. That's how powerful the bonding shift is. This is also why men are often confused by what looks like a downgrade. They assume women are always optimizing for resources. They forget that attachment does not follow spreadsheets. It follows chemistry. The professor didn't need to outperform Daniel. He just needed to arrive at the right moment with the right emotional triggers. Once that happened, the marriage was already over. This story is not unique. Variations of it play out everywhere. Co-workers, gyms, group activities, online spaces, anywhere emotional intimacy can develop under plausible deniability. Men assume threats look obvious, dominant, superior, dangerous. They rarely do. The real threat is proximity combined with novelty. This is why female infidelity often emerges from environments that seem harmless. Shared interests, emotional conversations, supportive roles. The danger is not sexual tension at first. It is emotional alignment. By the time sexual tension appears, the structure is already compromised. Daniel eventually recovered, but he never fully understood how quickly everything changed. He kept believing there was a moment he could have intervened. There wasn't. The decision had already been made internally. The rest was execution. This is what men need to understand. Female infidelity is not a single event. It is a process. By the time it becomes visible, it has already concluded. Trying to stop it at that stage is like trying to stop a train that already passed the station. You can run, you can shout, you can stand in front of it. It doesn't matter. The momentum is already there. And the most painful part is not the loss itself. It's realizing that while you were still invested, still present, still loyal, the relationship you were trying to protect had already been replaced in her mind. After the separation, what followed was even more revealing than the affair itself. This is the phase people rarely talk about, because it exposes the deepest asymmetry between male and female infidelity. When Daniel found out, his reaction was exactly what you would expect from a man whose attachment was still intact. He was devastated, but he wanted to fix it. He asked questions. He apologized for things he didn't even understand yet. He suggested counseling. He offered change. Real change, not theatrics. From his perspective, the relationship was damaged, not destroyed. Emily's response looked cooperative on the surface. She listened. She nodded. She even cried. To an outside observer, it looked like remorse. But there was something missing. Urgency. She wasn't fighting for the marriage. She was managing the fallout. This is the distinction men don't recognize until it's too late. When a man cheats and wants to reconcile, his emotional system is still fully invested. He is trying to restore equilibrium. When a woman cheats and agrees to try, she is often just buying time. Time to stabilize the transition. Time to secure the next phase. The bond has already moved. What remains is logistics. Emily stayed for a while. For the kids, for appearances, for comfort. But the marriage was no longer a living structure. It was a shell being maintained until it could be exited cleanly. Daniel felt this. He described it as living with someone who had already left. Conversations were polite. Cooperation was functional. Intimacy was gone. This is why reconciliation after female infidelity feels hollow. Men sense the absence, but they don't know how to name it. They assume it's part of the healing process, that time will soften it. Time does not restore redirected attachment. Eventually, Emily initiated the divorce. Calmly, decisively, without rage, without drama. The emotional work had already been done months earlier. Daniel was still processing betrayal when she was finalizing plans. This pattern repeats so often that it shows up in statistics. Men are far more likely to want to save a relationship after infidelity. Women are far more likely to leave. This is why women initiate the majority of divorces. Not because they are more emotional, but because they emotionally exit earlier. By the time paperwork is filed, the relationship has been over internally for a long time. Men misunderstand this timeline because they measure endings from the moment of discovery. Women measure endings from the moment attachment shifts. These are not the same point in time. This creates a cruel paradox. The partner who still wants the relationship is the one least capable of saving it. The partner who could save it no longer wants to. Daniel kept asking me the same question: why didn't she fight for us? The answer was simple and brutal. There was nothing left to fight for from her perspective. Once a woman's attachment has relocated, the original partner becomes emotionally irrelevant. Not hated, not despised, just obsolete. This is why men feel replaced rather than rejected. Rejection implies choice. Replacement implies system-level change. Emily didn't choose to stop loving Daniel in the way he imagined love. Her brain simply reassigned investment. The old bond decayed. A new one formed. From that moment on, reconciliation was impossible. This is where men often get trapped in false equivalence. They think I made mistakes too. I wasn't perfect. If I improve, maybe we can meet in the middle. But improvement does not compete with novelty once attachment has shifted. Another detail that shocked Daniel was how quickly Emily's narrative solidified. She began describing the marriage as empty, emotionally cold, intellectually unfulfilling. These descriptions emerged after the affair, not before. To Daniel, this felt like gaslighting. He remembered laughter, shared plans, years of cooperation and affection. But Emily wasn't consciously lying. Her emotional context had changed and memory reorganized around it. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of female infidelity. The past is not remembered as it was lived. It is remembered as it must be to justify the present. Men try to argue facts during this phase. They bring receipts, dates, events, proof of effort. It doesn't work because the disagreement isn't about facts. It's about emotional orientation. You cannot debate someone out of a reality their brain has reconstructed to maintain internal consistency. This is why men often feel like they're losing their sanity. They are arguing from a shared past that no longer exists in her mind. Emily didn't see herself as the villain. She saw herself as someone who finally understood the truth about her life. The affair wasn't a betrayal in her internal narrative. It was a revelation. This is what men don't anticipate. They assume guilt will bring accountability. But guilt requires allegiance. Once allegiance moves, guilt loses its grip. Daniel expected remorse. What he encountered was detachment. That detachment was more painful than anger would have been. Anger would have meant emotional engagement. Detachment meant the relationship no longer mattered. This is why female infidelity feels like an execution rather than an explosion. There is no chaos, no screaming, no collapse. Just a quiet ending that no one saw coming. And here is the part society refuses to acknowledge. When a woman cheats, the relationship rarely survives. Not because she is unforgivable, but because her emotional system has already completed the transition. Men who try to save these relationships often spend years blaming themselves. They assume they failed in some essential way. They internalize the outcome as proof of inadequacy. That belief is devastating and often inaccurate. Daniel did not lose his marriage because he lacked value. He lost it because he misunderstood how attachment shifts work. This is not a story about cruelty. It is a story about timing biology and ignorance. If Daniel had understood what was happening when the emotional distance first appeared, the outcome might have been different. Not guaranteed, but possible. By the time infidelity surfaced, it was already too late. This is the mistake men keep making. They respond to the visible event instead of the invisible process. They try to treat the symptom instead of recognizing the terminal diagnosis. And once you see that pattern clearly, you start to understand why so many men describe female infidelity as the end, not the crisis. Because by the time it becomes visible, the crisis is already over. What followed after the divorce taught me something even darker. Something most men only realize when the damage is already permanent. Daniel assumed the pain would be mutual. He believed that once the affair was exposed and the family dissolved, reality would hit Emily the same way it hit him. He thought regret would arrive later, if not immediately. He believed loss would balance the equation. It didn't. Emily moved forward with a clarity that unsettled everyone around her. There was no visible collapse, no period of confusion, no identity crisis. She reorganized her life with quiet efficiency. From the outside, it looked like strength. From the inside, it was something else entirely. It was completion. This is the part men rarely understand. By the time a woman cheats, she has already processed the end of the relationship emotionally. The grief already happened internally in private months or even years earlier. What comes after is not recovery. It is execution. Daniel, meanwhile, was only just beginning his grief. This mismatch is why female infidelity feels so cruel. One partner is in shock. The other is already on the other side of it. I watched Daniel cycle through the stages men always cycle through. Confusion, self-blame, bargaining, analysis. He replayed conversations, looked for turning points, asked himself what he could have done differently. Emily never entered that loop. There was nothing to analyze. The decision was settled. This is why men often feel discarded rather than left. Left implies deliberation. Discarded implies replacement. And replacement is exactly what happened. Within months, Emily was openly with the professor. Public photos, vacations, social media smiles. From Daniel's perspective, it looked inhuman, like the relationship never mattered at all. But that interpretation misses the truth. The relationship mattered deeply. That's why it had to be rewritten. This is another brutal asymmetry. When men cheat, they usually compartmentalize the affair away from their primary relationship. When women cheat, they often integrate the affair into a new narrative where the old relationship becomes invalid. This integration is what makes reversal impossible. Once the new bond becomes central to her identity, the old bond cannot coexist. It must be demoted, minimized, or erased. Not out of spite, but out of psychological necessity. I've seen men beg for closure during this phase. They want explanations that make sense. They want acknowledgement of shared history. They want some recognition that what they had was real. What they get instead is indifference. That indifference is not proof that the woman never cared. It is proof that caring has been redirected. This is why women initiate the majority of divorces, not because they are less loyal, but because they exit emotionally long before they exit structurally. By the time legal proceedings begin, the emotional severance is complete. Men, on the other hand, often remain emotionally attached long after the relationship ends. They experience the breakup as sudden and catastrophic because for them, it is. This explains another pattern men struggle with. When a woman cheats and leaves, she rarely wants to remain friends. She rarely wants extended discussion. She rarely wants to process together. From her perspective, processing is redundant. The conclusion has already been reached. Men interpret this as coldness. It is closure. This is also why female infidelity is so strongly correlated with divorce. When men cheat, a significant percentage of marriages survive. When women cheat, most do not. The difference is not morality. It is orientation. Male infidelity often exists alongside continued attachment. Female infidelity often marks the transfer of attachment. One damages the relationship. The other replaces it. This creates a painful imbalance in accountability. When a man cheats, he often wants to repair the damage. When a woman cheats, she often wants to justify the exit. That justification process is where things get especially destructive. I watched Emily begin reframing the past publicly. Not aggressively, calmly, selectively. Stories were adjusted, emphasis shifted, neutral events became negative. Ambiguity became proof. Daniel was painted as emotionally absent, unaware, insufficient. None of this had been articulated during the marriage. This narrative shift served a purpose. It protected her new identity from guilt. It aligned social perception with her internal reality. It ensured that the transition felt morally coherent. Men are rarely prepared for this. They assume truth is stable. They don't understand how memory reorganizes around emotional allegiance. Arguing against this new narrative is pointless. Facts do not override emotional logic once attachment has moved. This is where many men lose their dignity. They chase validation from someone who no longer needs to give it. They seek fairness from someone whose internal court has already closed the case. Daniel eventually stopped asking questions. Not because he got answers, but because he realized none were coming. The most damaging part wasn't the loss of the marriage. It was the realization that the person he thought he knew no longer existed in the same form. That realization breaks something fundamental in men. It challenges their understanding of continuity, of loyalty, of cause and effect. They assume relationships end when problems become intolerable. They don't realize relationships can end quietly internally while everything still looks intact on the surface. Female infidelity exposes this blind spot brutally. It teaches men that emotional reality does not announce itself. It migrates. By the time the migration becomes visible, the original territory has already been abandoned. This is why reconciliation feels like chasing a ghost. You're not repairing a bond, you're trying to resurrect one. And resurrection is not a skill biology supports. Understanding this is not about bitterness. It is about recognizing when effort is misapplied. When hope becomes self-destruction. Daniel eventually rebuilt his life. But he carried one insight with him that he wished he had understood earlier. The affair did not end his marriage. It revealed that it had already ended. And once that distinction is clear, many of the mysteries around female infidelity stop being mysteries at all. They become patterns. Predictable, repeatable, and devastating to those who don't see them coming. What unsettles most men is not just the betrayal itself, but the realization that it was prepared, that it didn't happen in a moment of weakness, that it unfolded slowly, deliberately, long before any line was crossed. Men tend to cheat impulsively. Opportunity appears, boundaries fail, regret follows. There is no long runway, no rehearsal, no internal justification campaign. Women cheat differently. Female infidelity is often preceded by a preparation phase, and that phase is where most relationships actually die. The preparation does not look dramatic. It looks reasonable, harmless, even responsible. Emotional distance begins to form under the guise of self-care, personal growth, or independence. She starts needing space. She becomes harder to reach. Conversations shorten. Intimacy feels scheduled rather than spontaneous. Men notice this, but they mislabel it. They assume stress, hormones, fatigue. They give space thinking they are being supportive. What they don't realize is that space is not neutral. Space is where attachment shifts. During this phase, fault-finding often begins. Small disagreements escalate. Past issues resurface. Neutral behaviors are reinterpreted as flaws. This is not random conflict. It is narrative construction. Her brain is building a moral framework that allows her to detach without seeing herself as the cause. By the time cheating occurs, she has already justified it internally. She has already decided who the villain is, and it is rarely herself. This is why female infidelity often comes with a long list of grievances that appear suddenly and all at once. Men feel blindsided by complaints they never heard before. That's because the complaints weren't relevant until they were needed. This is not manipulation in the cartoon sense. It is psychological self-protection. People cannot see themselves as good while doing something they believe is wrong. So the mind resolves the conflict by redefining the past. Another sign of preparation is appearance change. New clothes, new routines, renewed interest in fitness, new fragrance. These changes are often subtle but consistent. Men assume this means she is investing in the relationship. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it means she is investing in a future that does not include them. There is also behavioral secrecy. A phone that never leaves her hand. New passwords, notifications turned off. Conversations that end abruptly when you enter the room. Men hesitate to confront this. They don't want to seem controlling, insecure, paranoid. Society has trained them to second-guess their instincts. That hesitation is costly. The preparation phase is also when emotional triangulation begins. She may start confiding in someone else, a coworker, a friend, an ex. Someone positioned just far enough away to seem safe. This person becomes a mirror, a validator, a contrast. While you are being criticized at home, he is being praised in private. While you are associated with responsibility and routine, he is associated with freedom and novelty. This contrast accelerates attachment shift. By the time cheating occurs, the emotional bond is already established. Sex does not create the betrayal, it formalizes it. Men often assume they will see clear signs when cheating is imminent. They expect sudden distance or hostility. What they miss is that preparation often looks like emotional calm. She is not anxious. She is resolved. Once the affair is exposed, another disturbing process begins: gaslighting. Gaslighting is not always intentional cruelty. It is often defensive reality management. When confronted, she denies patterns that are obvious. She reframes your concern as insecurity, control, jealousy. You start questioning yourself. This is one of the most damaging aspects of female infidelity. Not the sex, the erosion of your trust in your own perception. She may accuse you of the very behavior she is engaging in. This is projection. Her guilt externalized. Her internal conflict displaced. If she suddenly becomes obsessed with the idea that you might be cheating without evidence, it is often because her own boundaries are already compromised. Men ignore this signal because it feels unfair, accusatory, illogical. They try to reason their way through it. You cannot reason with projection. Another pattern emerges during preparation: emotional withdrawal, combined with increased independence. She becomes less reliant on you emotionally while building support elsewhere. This makes the eventual separation feel easier for her. She has already distributed her emotional needs across a wider network. She is not facing loss alone. Men, by contrast, often place the majority of their emotional investment in one partner. When that bond is severed, the shock is total. This asymmetry is not discussed openly, but it shapes outcomes. By the time a woman cheats, she is rarely risking being alone. She has already ensured continuity, backup attachment, social reinforcement. This is why women rarely appear alone after breakups. Not because they move on quickly, but because they moved on early. Another harsh truth is that some women cheat specifically to end relationships. They don't want to initiate the breakup directly. They want moral cover. They want the man to react so they can point to his reaction as proof of why the relationship had to end. So they create a situation where discovery is likely. They push boundaries publicly. They grow careless. When the man finally confronts them or reacts with anger, that reaction becomes the justification. See, this is why I couldn't be with him. This exit strategy allows her to leave while retaining victim status. Men are rarely prepared for this because they assume cheating is reckless. They don't consider that it can be instrumental. The preparation phase also explains why female infidelity feels premeditated rather than accidental. It is not about lust. It is about transition. By the time the affair is known, the emotional groundwork is complete. The relationship has been dismantled internally. The rest is procedural. This is why men who wait for proof lose leverage. Proof arrives at the end, not the beginning. By the time you have certainty, the decision has already been made. Men want evidence before acting. Biology does not wait for evidence. Instinct often registers change long before logic can justify it. That instinct is dismissed, shamed, rationalized away. And that is how preparation succeeds. Understanding this phase is not about becoming paranoid. It is about recognizing that emotional distance is not neutral. It is directional. When attachment begins to move, it leaves tracks. Men who ignore those tracks do not preserve trust. They surrender agency. By the time cheating occurs, the relationship is not damaged. It is concluded. The mistake men make is thinking the affair is the problem. The affair is the receipt. Once you understand preparation, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore. This is where female infidelity stops looking emotional and starts looking strategic, not in a cinematic sense, in a biological sense. I call this phase branch swinging. The term sounds crude, but the behavior is precise. A woman rarely lets go of one branch until her hand is firmly on the next. Security is never abandoned without replacement. Attachment is transferred, not dropped. Men do not operate this way. When men cheat, they risk loss. They gamble. They act without a safety net. When women cheat, they often hedge. They manage risk. This is why female infidelity feels calculated after the fact. Because it is. During this phase, the primary relationship is maintained just enough to keep stability intact. Bills are paid. Routines continue. The surface remains calm. Underneath a new attachment is being tested. She needs to know if the new man is viable. Emotionally, logistically, socially. This testing phase is subtle. It looks like friendship, support, emotional availability. Plausible deniability protects it. If the new attachment proves unreliable, she pulls back. The original relationship remains intact. If the new attachment responds, invests, and signals commitment, the transfer accelerates. This is not cruelty. It is survival strategy. Women evolved under conditions where being alone was dangerous. Emotional and material continuity mattered. Branch swinging ensured transition without exposure. Modern society did not remove this instinct. It expanded its reach. This is where the concept of the orbit becomes critical. Many women maintain an orbit of potential replacements. These are men positioned just outside the boundary of impropriety. Co-workers, old friends, exes, even your friends. They are close enough to provide validation, far enough to maintain innocence. She gives them just enough attention to keep the channel open, not enough to trigger suspicion, until she needs them. Men misunderstand this because they assume attraction is binary. Either something is happening or it isn't. In reality, attachment can be incubated quietly. Social media has weaponized this dynamic. Before, a woman's options were local. Now they are global. Likes, messages, comments. Each one reinforces optionality. Each one signals availability. This creates a constant background of validation, a sense that alternatives are abundant, that leaving is not dangerous. One argument, one bad week, one moment of dissatisfaction, and there are dozens of men ready to reinforce her sense of being desired. This changes the cost-benefit calculation dramatically. Men sleep next to women who already have contingency plans. They don't realize it because nothing overt is happening yet. But the system is in place. This is why female infidelity often looks sudden, but isn't. The infrastructure existed long before the affair. Another critical element in this phase is gaslighting. Gaslighting is not just lying. It is reality distortion. When you sense something is wrong and express concern, she reframes it. You are insecure, controlling, paranoid. You begin to doubt your perception. This self-doubt is devastating. It disables your ability to act. It delays response. It erodes confidence. And the more uncertain you become, the more power shifts. Gaslighting is often accompanied by projection. She accuses you of cheating, of emotional distance, of secrecy. These accusations feel unfair because they are. They are not based on evidence. They are based on internal guilt. Projection externalizes her conflict. It allows her to disown what she is doing by assigning it to you. Men respond to this by trying to prove innocence. They explain, reassure, over-communicate. This only deepens the imbalance. While you are defending yourself, she is consolidating her exit. This is where many men lose their sense of self. They stop trusting their instincts. They defer to her narrative. They accept blame for problems they did not create. By the time the truth emerges, the psychological damage is already done. The betrayal hurts, but the self-doubt lingers longer. Another pattern that emerges during this phase is moral reversal. She begins to position herself as the oppressed party, the one who endured, the one who tried, the one who had no choice. Her infidelity becomes framed as an outcome, not an action. You become the cause. She becomes the effect. This framing is powerful because it recruits social support. Friends, family, colleagues. By the time you are reacting to betrayal, the story has already been told. Men are stunned by how quickly public opinion turns. They assume truth will protect them. It doesn't. Narrative moves faster than fact. This is why men often feel punished twice. Once by the betrayal, again by the aftermath. And here is the hardest truth to accept. In many cases, the woman does not see herself as deceptive. She believes her version of events. Her brain has aligned memory, emotion, and justification into a coherent story. You are not arguing with dishonesty. You are arguing with internal consistency. That is a losing battle. This is why trying to expose hypocrisy rarely works. Why pointing out contradictions achieves nothing. Why asking for accountability feels like shouting into a void. The system is closed. Once branch swinging completes, the original relationship is no longer relevant, except as an obstacle. Men feel this shift viscerally. They describe it as being replaced before being removed. That description is accurate. And this is where many men finally ask the wrong question. They ask, how do I stop this? The answer is brutal. You usually can't. Not at this stage. Once branch swinging is active, once the orbit is engaged, once gaslighting has begun, the outcome is largely determined. The only remaining variable is how much damage you absorb before it ends. This is why understanding these patterns early matters. Not to control, not to monitor, but to recognize when emotional alignment has already moved. Men who wait for certainty surrender leverage. Men who ignore instinct lose time. Instinct is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. When attachment begins to shift, behavior changes. Attention reallocates. Respect erodes. These are not random fluctuations. They are directional signals. Most men are taught to ignore them. That lesson is costly. By the time the affair is exposed, the relationship is no longer a shared reality. It is a transition already completed internally. The mistake is thinking the exposure is the turning point. It isn't. It is the announcement. What I want you to take from this is not fear, bitterness, or suspicion. The real lesson is responsibility, specifically responsibility for awareness. Most pain in life does not come from malice. It comes from misunderstanding how things actually work. We assume intentions matter more than patterns. We assume effort can fix anything. We assume love once given stays where we left it. Those assumptions feel comforting, but they are not reliable. The uncomfortable truth is, this boundaries protect what feelings cannot. Trust is not preserved by blindness. It is preserved by clarity. When you understand human nature, yours and others, you stop negotiating with illusions. You stop chasing explanations that will never come. You stop trying to revive connections that have already moved on. This applies far beyond relationships, in work, in friendships, in life. When something consistently drains you, confuses you, or erodes your sense of self, the problem is not that you aren't trying hard enough. The problem is that you are trying to force alignment where it no longer exists. Maturity is knowing when to invest and when to walk away, without needing permission, validation, or revenge. You don't need to hate anyone to leave. You don't need to prove anything to reclaim your dignity. Sometimes the strongest move is accepting reality early, quietly, and on your own terms. If this resonated with you, I'd like to hear your perspective. Leave a comment and share what stood out or what you've experienced in your own life. And if you value calm, honest conversations about human behavior, relationships, and self-respect, consider subscribing to the channel. No pressure, just intention. Thank you for listening.